Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to come here. I'm Gwangju, a volunteer at GIC. Before we begin our talk, please make sure that your cell phone has been turned off or switched to silent mode. Actually, today is the last day of our volunteering as a topic members. It has been our honor to have this opportunity. Thank you. So we want to introduce our topic members. And I would like to introduce the volunteers of the top team. Come over here.
Hello everyone, I'm Kwan and currently I'm studying in Honam National University as an exchange student. So I hope to see you more in GIC talk. It's been a pleasure to meet you guys.
Hello, my name is Kim and I'm a university student volunteering here and I'm really pleased to meet you and have this chance. Thank you.
I'm also a university student volunteer in GIC. Nice to meet you. Hi, my name is Yeonjin Jung. I'm also a student volunteer in here. Nice to meet you. Hi, I'm Park and you're volunteering this program. Nice to meet you.
Today's topic is the intersection between computer science and government. When most people think of computer science, perhaps the last thing they think about is government. Yet, as we will discuss in this talk, the government provides critical leadership in the development of computer science as we know it today. This talk discusses how many of the common things we take for granted. It will also discuss how forward-thinking government scientists design a post-war institution. And this talk argues that computer scientists should work in partnership with social scientists who have insight into norms, institutions, and political power. The presenter of this topic is Wang. He is an assistant professor at Honam University and received a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from UC Berkeley in 2003. Now let's welcome him with a round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. Let me take a second to open my folder. Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Wang, and I'll be your presenter today. I'm really happy to be here with you, and I just wanted to thank you for choosing to spend your time here with me. I put a lot of effort into this presentation, and I hope that I can meet your expectations. Mostly what I have in this presentation, I've already committed to my memory, but occasionally I need to look at the notes on my paper. So if you don't mind, I would like to look at my notes sometimes. So the question is, what does government have to do with computer science? And I would like to do that by discussing 3 points with you today. So point 1 is to explore the role that government had in building the internet. Point number 2 is to talk about how computer science influenced government in Tunisia, Egypt, and also in the election of Barack Obama to the United States. And then point 3, I want to talk about how social scientists could work with computer scientists to build a better tomorrow. So first, point 1, so institutional structure. So it was during World War II, so basically scientific research during World War II was sort of the big bang of where the cooperation between government and computer science took place. And so it started with a man. His name was Guangju Bush. Let me see if I can find the PowerPoint. So that's the name. That's a picture of Guangju right there. He was the dean of engineering at MIT, and he was also the vice president of MIT. So he was a man with a lot of gravitas, and definitely someone that the president of the United States would listen to. And so Guangju, so people always joke that his name is very difficult to pronounce, but it's pronounced Guangju Bush. So his first observation was that scientists and military people were not working very well together. And that was a concern to him. During World War II, he observed that scientists and military people weren't working very well together. And so during World War II, he basically went to President Franklin Roosevelt. That's Franklin Roosevelt. And he advocated for the founding of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. And so that came out of his concern of the conflict between civilian scientists and military people. So what he observed was that scientists tended to respect latitude, they wanted freedom, and that they were kind of rebels against the past. Whereas, in contrast, the military officers, they had a respect for tradition and authorities. And so when he went to President Roosevelt to have his office founded, he wanted to report directly to President Roosevelt to have a political line of authority, and also so basically that gave him political leverage if he needed to overrule one of the officers in the military. And so President Roosevelt approved this plan in about 15 minutes. And so Guangju Bush was declared the first director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. And it was very much necessary. In order to win World War II, the government needed to enlist the active service of scientists and to have some kind of interface between scientists and military officers. It was also detached from the services. So in the United States of America, we sort of have, at that time we had 3 branches of the military. So we have Army, we also have the Navy, and we also have the Air Force. And so if you can kind of imagine the politics behind running a big organization like that, so these 3 services, they were always kind of competing with each other. And for, I guess, their area of influence. And so there was that problem. So there was a problem of rivalry between the services, and also there was the problem of working with civilian scientists. And so this sort of institutional structure that Guangju Bush developed was very, very important for that. The most notable success that Guangju Bush had in working with civilian scientists and the military was, of course, the atomic weapon. So, do you guys know about the Manhattan Project? So the Manhattan Project was the development of nuclear weapons, right? And so in order to do that, you could understand that it was a very large project indeed. And then they needed to have a cooperation between scientists, government, and the military. And so that was very successful. The United States was very successfully able to develop nuclear weapons. And of course, you guys all know, we won World War II. But the problem came, I think, after World War II. So there was some, I think, decision about what to do about post-war, how to promote peacetime research. And so what President Roosevelt asked Vannevar Bush to do was to write a report about how scientists could better cooperate with the government. And he wrote a report called Science, the Endless Frontier. And basically, he advocated for the establishment of the National Research Foundation. And so, I think one of the big points that he makes in his reports is that science is really important. He says that scientists, people around the world had respected science to give people a better future. And so he said that better science meant more abundant crops, it meant better defense, it meant more leisure time, it meant more recreation, it meant people could avoid the drudgery of the mundane tasks they had to take care of. And it also meant higher wages. So, of course, you in South Korea, I think you can relate to that because your country makes memory chips, it makes cell phones, it makes some of the most advanced boats in the world. And so that has definitely raised your standard of living. And so this is what Vannevar Bush had imagined, was that science and engineering would kind of pull the United States ahead. And so it was critically important. Number two in this report is that he established government as sort of a patron of the sciences. So that meant that the government would give money to scientists to do research. And the institutional structure that he imagined doing that would be basically giving money to scientists at universities where they sort of had the independence and then also where they had the community to kind of support these scientists. So just imagine a PhD student in physics, for example. And so if he wanted to do post-war research, then he could get money for his PhD from the government, but also have other PhD students also support his research and also to read his article, so peer review. And then he said, the third point that he mentioned a lot of points, but I'm kind of just boiling down this report for you so that it kind of makes sense in the context of what I'm speaking about. But he also said, most importantly, I think that that private companies shouldn't be counted on to do this. He said that this is definitely in the domain of government. He said that this definitely falls under the United States' constitutional obligation to provide for the public welfare. And he said the reason why private companies couldn't do this is because he said private companies were mostly interested in products. And so that meant already available discoveries. It means things that it meant things in science that had already been discovered. And so, but what he was thinking about was more in terms of basic research. So I'll define basic research for you, which means that basic research is so the things that haven't been discovered. And he says in a way that these basic research that scientists perform are actually even more important than sort of the product orientation that companies do, because basically these new technologies like atomic weapons or being able to harness nuclear energy allow the United States to leapfrog other countries. And after World War II, basically a lot of Europe was destroyed, and so a lot of people around the world were wondering, who's going to be the leader in terms of science? And I think with this report, Bush definitely envisioned that the United States would be the leader. The other thing he also noted was that if private companies funded basic research, the government should not fund it at all. The reason he gave for that is because if private companies gave money to researchers to do this, then they probably want some kind of protection or like some kind of patent, and then the invention would kind of just be their own. But he had envisioned where the discoveries made by scientists would be for the public good. And so his report never got implemented. So Roosevelt died, and so his proposal for the National Research Foundation really went nowhere. But there was a catalyst. The catalyst was that the Soviets discovered nuclear weapons. So in 1949, Russia, I guess through espionage and also through a lot of their own work and development in this field, they were also able to develop nuclear weapons in 1949. In 1950, the National Science Foundation, which is pretty much what Bush wanted, was implemented. So that was founded in 1950. The next catalyst I want to talk to you about, and this was really kind of the big one, I think, for a lot of things that I want to talk about today, was Sputnik was launched. So that's a picture of Sputnik. This is actually not the real Sputnik, but actually in Washington, D.C., at the Smithsonian Museum, we had a copy of it built. Strangely enough, it's a big part of American history because it sort of spurred all of this scientific development that I want to talk to you about today. Sputnik was a catalyst for the founding of the Advanced Research Projects Agency. And so Sputnik was launched in 1957, and then the Advanced Research Projects Agency was founded in 1958. So you can see very much how there was this Soviet action, and then there was this juxtaposition of American action in response to perceived superior strength by the Soviets. And publicly, Eisenhower, who was president at this time, he wasn't worried about this, but in private he was very worried. He definitely realized this was a security problem, and so these two institutions were founded. The Information Processing Techniques Office basically invented ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet. And so information processing techniques basically came out of Space and Command. I'm just curious, does anyone know what, I guess, information processing and Space Command have to do with each other, like how they relate at all? Anyone? Okay, so, I didn't either, right? I didn't either. And so, actually, there's a myth. There's a myth about how the internet was invented. One myth that I heard was that the internet was invented so that if the United States was ever attacked by nuclear weapons, then sort of we would have this network of communications that would survive after the war. And definitely redundancy and survivability was an issue. But it wasn't the reason why the internet was invented. The reason why the internet was invented was because, so I told you that the Soviets invented nuclear weapons, right? Which means that they also had capabilities to send missiles into the United States. And so that was also definitely a security concern, too. By this time, we had also developed radar, which means that we could see things in the sky. But what we didn't have was sort of the technology to understand if something in space or in the sky was in fact an ICBM, or if it was a bird, or if it was some kind of artillery fire. So we needed to have some way to understand if something in the sky was a nuclear weapon, and then for the United States military officers to decide if that was a threat, with what we should do after that. So if we should shoot it down, or in fact even what city it's heading for. So the problem with and so in order to understand if something in the sky was in fact a missile heading for the United States, then we needed computers. Computers can do advanced arithmetic. They could do it very fast, and it'd be something that definitely we want computers to do, not humans, because it would take too long. The problem with computers at this time was that they still used punch cards. So computer programs basically still were stored on these punch cards, right? And so it took a lot of time for computer scientists to punch these computer programs, and then also they had to be error corrected, and then they had to be corrected, and then they had to be error corrected again. And so all this took a long time. So you can imagine that once they already put these computer programs through the machine, then they had to print it out. It would take about 3 days. It would take about 3 days for you to input a computer program and then for them to print out the results. And so the problem with that was that it also took too long, right? People spent almost as much time sort of setting up that problem as they did in trying to figure out the problem itself. And computers took these large rooms, right? And then they fed these computer programs in here. So definitely not what people wanted. And so they had to come up with some way. They had to invent interactive computing. They had to have some way of having humans interact with computers, right? And so in order to do that, they had to invent time sharing. They had to invent networking, because military officers didn't want to be in this room, right? And so they had to have networking, right? And so they also had different computers. These computers took up big rooms, right? And so they had to have some way to network these computers. If I could make an analogy, so you guys know Windows, right? You guys know Windows? And then we also have Macintosh. So before, these computers, Windows and Macintosh, couldn't talk to each other, right? Until the internet was invented. Then they could talk to each other pretty well. And so they had to invent networking so that humans could interact well with computers. And they also had to have packet switching. The other thing I want to note that's interesting about this is that ARPA basically adopted the National Science Foundation framework, the same one that Guinevere Bush had proposed. So this meant direct line of authority to the Secretary of Defense. And also scientists had a lot of freedom to do basic research. So they weren't tied to this sort of product development that the military officers wanted, right? And also universities. Universities would be independent centers of research where the government would freely fund scientists to kind of develop the technologies that were necessary to detect, to work on things that, for the IPTO. Okay, so this is my slide about ICBM missile, right? And so they have some complicated mathematics that they needed to do. This is interactive computing, right? And so this is very different from the computing that they originally had of punch cards. So there's a monitor, so people could interact with computers, and also keyboard and mouse. Although that was more so, I think, invented at Xerox PARC. But a lot of the early work, the preliminary work for the development of the mouse, did also come from this laboratory as well. The next person I want to talk about is J.C.R. Lipplander. And so he was a very he was also a professor at MIT. And under his leadership, he encouraged scientists to talk to one another. So remember, they had to come up with interactive computing. And so he proposed this structure in which they would fund sort of centers of excellence. So centers of excellence would be the specific places where modern computer science would be developed. And so this was UC Berkeley, MIT, University of Illinois at Urbana, UCLA, University of Michigan, and also Carnegie Mellon. So 6 universities that he had designated. And so he basically chose these universities because he felt that they had a collection of good people there already. That was one reason. The second reason that he gave was that they had good departments with good reputations. And then number 3 is that they had an economies of scale. So these are big universities. They're not small universities, which means that the rent for these scientists' laboratories would already be paid for. The government didn't need to pay for that. So the government could just basically fund scientists' research. What's also interesting to note about Lippmander's leadership was that he hand-selected people. So he encouraged people to form lectures and seminars. He encouraged them to go to society meetings. He encouraged them to have like parties and to kind of socialize and get to know people, sort of after hours. And so you can just imagine, having a drink with your boss, right? That's how people in Korea know that they get to know their boss, right? And that's how people feel comfortable with each other. And so he encouraged scientists to talk to another. So he would go to one scientist. He said, "Hey, why don't you talk to Bob Smith? He's doing some really interesting research in your same area." And so he was definitely trying to, I think, stir the pot a little bit. And I think that was definitely part of what made computer science at the early stage form communities. Communities where scientists could talk to each other and not just rely on their own research. Also, what's interesting is that Lippmander also offers his own vision of computer science. And his vision of computer science is where computers and machines would work in partnership to amplify human talent and for a better tomorrow. And I think that even today, we are still working with that. We're still working with how to make computers work better with humans. And so just for example, today, I wanted to make this PowerPoint presentation, but actually I was a little bit afraid of making a PowerPoint because I was afraid that maybe too much of my time would be spent on trying to make tables and pictures, and I would sort of kind of get into analysis paralysis and I would kind of get stuck, rather than working on something that was really important for my talk. And I think a lot of people share that frustration with computer these days. Computers crash, they have data corruption, maybe you don't know how to use something on the computer. And so we're definitely still struggling with Lippmander's vision for computers. So some lessons from the past. So scientists, I think, they need protection. So they definitely need protection from product orientation, and the government was supposed to fund that, because scientists are in a fight with the old. So the new is always in a struggle with the old, right? And product orientation. But I think what was what caught me most about when I was doing this research in the course of doing my for graduate school was that was that these people were really good civil servants. So they were really concerned citizens who wanted to do something good for their country. And not only that, but they were in a good position to do that. And they were also very politically astute. So originally, the military wanted scientists to be under the military officers, right? But Vannevar Bush said, no, we can't have that. Scientists need to be independent from the military. And so that was really smart. If Vannevar Bush hadn't done that, then we wouldn't have gotten this. I don't think we would have gotten so much innovation from these scientists. Okay, so 30 minutes into my talk. If I have enough time, then I want to also talk about Tunisia and Egypt, and hopefully about how Barack Obama got elected. So perhaps things that we can relate to more so in the modern day. So first, Tunisia and Egypt. So my undergraduate major at Berkeley was in political science. And so this is an area that I understand a lot about. What's interesting to note about Tunisia and Egypt is that there is a lot of corruption in these countries. There's a lot of crony capitalism. And so crony capitalism basically meant that you could pay someone. So for example, let's say you did something wrong, you could pay a police officer, and they would say, okay, you can go. Or let's say that you wanted a really big government contract and you had lots of money. Well, you could basically pay someone who is very high up, and then they would give that service to you, right? The problem with that is that we all suffer. If people could simply just pay for to deliver some kind of service to the government, because maybe their service is not the best, right? And Egypt and Tunisia were notoriously corrupt countries for crony capitalism. And a lot of people weren't happy in these countries. They weren't the best administered, they weren't the most transparent, and so there was a lot of disaffected young people. So remember, young people make revolutions. And so people weren't happy about that. Okay, so Facebook, Twitter. You guys all know Facebook, right? You guys use Facebook, and then you guys also use Twitter, right? So a lot of people said that Facebook and Twitter had caused the revolutions in Tunisia, in Egypt. I think that that's only, to some extent that's true, but it's not completely true, because revolutions happen in the streets. Revolutions happen when people like me and you get in the streets and protest against our government to say, we're not happy about what you're doing here. You need to improve this, right? And so, so Facebook and Twitter can't be given credit for that. So there was a catalyst. There was a catalyst for all this happening, and there was a name. His name was Mohammed Bouazizi. Let me show you this picture. Oh, so this is forming communities. This is a picture of Mohammed Bouazizi. And basically he was a poor vegetable seller. And he was just pretty much minding his own business, selling his vegetables and his fruit in the street, when two police officers came and kind of harassed him. They were saying, well, hey, do you have a business license? And he said, no, I didn't know I needed to have a business license. They're like, oh, no, well, we need to take away your wheelbarrow. We need to take away your things, right? And so he complained. He went to an office and complained that to get his wheelbarrow back, and but he couldn't. And so when he went to this office, basically people had really embarrassed and humiliated him. And he was so humiliated by this act that he set himself on fire in the streets of Tunisia. And this was the catalyst that started the revolution there. And then this went viral. People shared this pictures, people shared photos on Facebook, and they were saying, look, it's like this person can be just like you, right? And it really took off. on Facebook. And people started to use Facebook and Twitter to kind of communicate, to, one, I think, document these kind of human rights violations that were happening. And number two is to share them with their friends. And so Facebook didn't cause the revolution, but it definitely was an enabling technology. Next, about Egypt. So Hosni Mubarak was in power for the last 30 years. And unlike Tunisia, Egypt's a very, very important country, geopolitically. It has 86 million people. It's somewhat semi-secular. And it was, until that point, it was kind of an example of a stable Arab democracy. And also it's the location of the Suez Canal, which a lot of commerce, a lot of ships flow through. And also Egypt had a lot of college-educated people that, that didn't have jobs. So this is an example of how Egypt's government was not functioning. It wasn't serving its people. There was a lot of this crony capitalism. The catalyst in Egypt was a man named this Khalid said. So this is the Facebook group. As of now, there's 245,000 subscribers to this Facebook group. And basically what happened to this young man, so I mean he's not bad looking, right? And recently, you know, he's maybe someone who's just like me or you, right? And he was the first face of the Egyptian revolution. What happened to him was that he was in a PC bomb, right, or a PC room, and police officers took him out and basically started beating him and, you know, kicking his teeth in and doing all kinds of very bad things to him. I saw those pictures, but I don't want to show them to you today. But basically they claimed that he was resisting arrest. So they made up some false reason to take him in the first place. And number two is that they basically beat him, and there was a lot of witnesses. And there was a lot of evidence of this. There was people who testified that police officers were being using too much force. They were using torture. And so someone made a Facebook group, and his Facebook group was called We Are All, Khalid said. And so this was the catalyst that people needed in Egypt. And so you guys know, actually I labeled it, right? So this is Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt. I think that a lot of this had been built up, you know, even before Khalid said was beaten by police officers. But I think that what's important about him is that he was just one example of something that happened to someone just like me or you that people could identify with, that people could say, you know, I don't want that to happen to my son or daughter or to my friend. And I think, by the way, the reason why the police officers had beaten him is because his family said that they had evidence of the police officers dealing drugs, right? So I mean, this is Crony Capitalism, right? Police officers were as corrupt, you know, were very corrupt, and so you couldn't rely on justice or the administration of justice here. I think I'm going to have to skip BarackObama.com, so I'll just get to the conclusion of my talk with the time that I have left, maybe about 10 minutes. So my first point talking about the office, the IPTO, was to talk about how government had influenced computer science. They basically invented computer science, basically because of what the government needed in order to win the war. And then my second point in talking about Tunisia and Egypt was simply to point out that computer science also had influenced government. And so these are two large forces, two major forces. And then the last point I just want to talk to you about, hopefully that I can finish in 10 minutes, is what social scientists can do to aid computer scientists in making better software. And so this is for a lot of computer scientists, this is what their vision of the future is. Computer scientists talk about feasibility, right? So they talk about the kind of technologies that make our computing possible, right? So inventing things like microprocessors, and inventing things like memory chips, and inventing things like mouses. Business. So if any of you guys are a business major, or you're sort of in a business, their value added is viability, to talk about the economics. So if something costs, $1 trillion, so for example, some people talk about making the Starship Enterprise, and so $1 trillion is not really viable, right? So that's where business people come in. And then this is where people like me come in. So we add human values. We talk about usability, and we talk about desirability. By the way, I got this graphic from Stanford University, so their Institute of Design. And so basically that is basically just for their graduate program. It's for people who are graduates who are pursuing a graduate degree in MBA or computer science or communications, and so they have sort of this institute where people kind of cross-collaborate with each other. Also, I think that social scientists can ask good questions, so we can provide sensibility to old age problems. And when people like me, we have a knowledge about norms, institutions, and political problems. And we also understand something about designing engaging interfaces. And so what I want to, and so software can only be as generous as we make it. And so the problem is that computer scientists often think very technically, right, about a problem, but they don't really think a lot about this human component to it, right, about usability. So what I want to do is I want to build applications for government. I want to help government agencies to work with each other better, to have a better conversation, better communication, a better decision-making process, a better sense-making process. The United States government is the largest producer of data in the world, and so with that data, we could really, I think, make a lot of charts and diagrams with computers that automatically do this to help policymakers make decisions about important policy areas. One example of how computer science, how government is using computer science is tiered patents. And so this is the United States Patent Office. And so before, the old model was that if you wanted a patent in America, what you had to do is you had to go to the patent office, and basically one government bureaucrat could decide if someone owns a patent for the next 20 years. And that's really outstanding, right? I mean, like, you guys hear about Samsung versus Apple, and and so research in motion, suing another company. And so this is the battle over intellectual property is definitely something that's very important. What pure patent is basically a way to crowdsource from people like me and you, so that way before a patent gets approved by the government, people would be able to offer their thoughts and comments and also their expertise before patents get approved. And I think a lot of countries are starting to also adopt this system. So that's one example of how crowdsourcing is being used in government. Another example that I think would be very interesting, so imagine that, let's say after Egypt collapsed, what if the citizens, the people of Egypt could crowdsource their opinion about their top 5 priorities for their new government? That'd be exciting, right? I want a job. I want clean water. I want efficient and transparent government operation, right? And so people like me and you could crowdsource for the government the top 5 things that we want our new government to work on. And so I think that's a really exciting area for computer scientists to work on, crowdsourcing. I already mentioned that. So agencies also working with each other to have a better conversation, better communication, better sense making. And I also want to build apps that allow for a stronger civil society. So there was a Harvard sociologist, his name is Robert Putnam, and he noted that things like television and the internet actually weaken. His theory was that things like the internet actually weaken civil society. So for example, let's say that, so actually Egypt is a good example, actually. So with Facebook and Twitter, we can make the Egyptian government fall down, right? But what computer science can't do is it can't make a government after the government's already collapsed. And so for that you need people, right? So for that we need to have what Robert Putnam calls social capital, right? So let's say that right here you guys are Group A, and right here you guys are Group B. Group A, you guys only talk to each other on Facebook and Twitter, and then Group B, you guys know each other from church, right? So which group, Group A or Group B, has more social capital, do you think? B. B definitely has more social capital, right? Because these people go to church every single Sunday, they meet each other, and then they're willing to do things for each other, right? They're willing to go out for coffee. They're willing to go to each other's speech and presentations. But Group A, you guys only know each other on Facebook and Twitter, and you probably will never meet each other in real life, right? So in Group A, there's much less social capital. And what Robert Putnam said at Harvard University was that Group A is really dangerous because you can make governments fall down, but Group B is the one that's going to take power after Group A makes the government fall down. And so I think we need better apps. We need better apps to help people make a better civil society, to make people have better relationships with each other, so people could arrange themselves according to their interests and according to what they desire in life. And so that's really important. There's already some companies like Meetup.com that do that. They allow people, for example, if I wanted to start a Frisbee club, then I can, right? Or if I wanted to start a computer science club in Gwangju, I could use Meetup.com and invite all of you to come meet me and then talk about our latest research, right? And so that's a strong civil association. And so I think that of all the areas that computer science could have impact on, government is by far the most important, and that's what I want to study in graduate school. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for your talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Now we're going to begin the question and answer portion. If you did not receive a piece of paper when you came in, raise your hand, and one of our volunteers will give you a piece of paper for writing a question. And also, one more note before we start the Q&A. Please do not raise your hand to ask a question. We prefer that you submit it in written format so that I can ask it up here. So, okay, with that out of the way, we'd like to ask a few quick personal questions.
Oh, sure.
First one, when and why did you first come to Korea?
I came to Korea 4 years ago. So at that time, I was looking for a job, and I went to my school's career center, career fair. And so basically, it's just a big room with a lot of people who have jobs. And then one person had a job to come to South Korea. And so I thought that was a really cool idea, and so I came here.
So you stayed for 4 years?
Sure, yeah.
Why did you stay? Have you liked it?
I love it here. I mean, this is an awesome place. Yeah, I'm not sure a lot of Koreans know this, but I mean, Gwangju is awesome. I mean, it's like a really great place to be. I mean, you can stay up all night and talk with your friends, and there's very kind and generous people here, and you guys have great public transportation and really good health care.
This might be a little too close to home.
Okay.
If it is, bat me away. Do you have any family or family here?
Do I have any family? No, I have friends, but no family.
Okay. I'll back away. All right. How long do you plan to stay? Or what are your future plans generally?
Well, I'm applying for computer science graduate schools. So right now, actually, my first application is due December 15th. And then I hope that by September 2013, then I should move on with my next stage in life.
Okay. All right. Okay, thanks. Now we'll talk about some of the things you spoke about during the talk. The first one, in the beginning you mentioned a lot about the government's role, the United States government's role in science, technology, and innovation.
Sure.
Yet, in the United States, it's commonly assumed that the government is inefficient. Why do you think there's that disconnect?
Actually, I don't think that's true. I think that actually the government is one of the biggest promoters of innovation that there is. And so one example is that our land-grant colleges, my own university I went to, the government basically generously gave this land to different states across the country so that way they could build colleges that would be needed for the expansion of America, like agricultural schools. And then also, what I talked about today, the government basically, through its own initiative, invented the internet. I think that maybe when people talk about when the government is inefficient is when they go to like the DMV or when they, or even trying to work through the Commerce Office to get something imported. There's a lot of rules and bureaucracy that people need to go through. But I don't think it's true that government is not an innovator.
Okay. It is surprising with everything you mentioned. We don't usually hear it like that.
That's true, yeah.
So that was interesting. Okay, so what things are the United States government investing in today in terms of technology?
Oh, well, you know, the Predator drones, right? So remote control, well, maybe this is not so good because this involves the people dying, but like, you know, the Predator drones, or they even have, so basically like worms. Like, have you ever seen, what is it, Minority Report? Actually, Minority Report is a really good movie that talks about future computer inventions. And so they have like little spiders that go around without people, and then they can kind of search rooms without putting people in harm's way. And so that's one example of what the government's working on.
Okay. The United States government puts a lot of money into defense spending.
Yes.
Do they rely on private companies in a lot of these cases?
I think they do. From the recent research that I've done, I think they do seem to use private companies. I'm not sure if that's because of the recent administration of George W. Bush, but I had seen some DARPA projects, for example, that they were funding private companies.
You mentioned his name is Honam, right?
Yes.
He seemed to have a fear of collusion between private companies and the government.
Yes.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Did his worst fears come true today?
Did his worst fears come true? Not necessarily. So what he was saying is that the government shouldn't fund the same projects that private companies are funding. So for example, that would be like, you know, in stem cell research. Let's say that, actually this is true, somewhat true at my own school at UC Berkeley. Private companies are giving money to the molecular and cell biology department, and the government is also funding them. And so there's some talk about conflict of interest. So to some extent, I think, yeah, it is some of what Gwangju Bush advocated the government not to is coming true.
Okay. Speaking of computer science today, is a lot of the innovation taking place in the public sector or the private sector today?
A lot of the innovation. Well, if you're talking about basic research, I think that the universities are still kind of the center. But that being said, I think private companies, my friend has a master's from Berkeley in electrical engineering. And he says that basically a lot of the chip work that they're doing for their routers are actually even more sophisticated than what his professors are working on.
We have some questions about kind of like the future of the internet and its relation with the government. Do you think there will be a sort of clampdown on the freedom of the internet in the future? Or will it remain open and possibly grow, become even more open?
I hope there's not a clampdown. So that's an issue. There was a bill called SOPA that basically made companies like Google and enforce copyrights, right? That's a terrible idea. And also, I think there was also some debate about net neutrality. So, for example, can some types of services, like video, be prioritized over other types of traffic? And mostly the founders of the internet, for example, like Robert Kahn and Cerf, advocated against doing that. So, for example, if you had traffic from point A to point B, then your traffic and also his traffic are sort of have the same priority. But there is some things I think that the government can do. Sender authentication is one of them. So for example, I get an email from Citibank, right? And they said that they want my password and my account number. Well, right now there's no way for me to verify who sent it to me, right? And I think that some things like that, email sender authentication, the government can do that.
Okay. Let's see. Can you tell us more about crowdsourcing? From what I got from it, I didn't have a very good understanding of it, and that's probably because of me. But it sounded almost like you watch a YouTube video, you like it, and you comment under it. Is it similar?
It is very similar.
Okay.
Do you guys know Wikipedia? Wikipedia? Yeah, Wikipedia is the best example of crowdsourcing that I know. Many experts, contribute, and in some ways, Wikipedia is a more comprehensive encyclopedia and also faster updating than Encyclopedia Britannica, because it has all these people who offer their expertise to the central website.
Okay. Can you see any negatives to the development of computer technology?
Well, definitely, yeah. Privacy, for example, yeah. So, I mean, if everything, you guys know in Korea, you guys have CCTV in your hagwons, and you have CCTV in banks. You have CCTV when you're driving in your car. And in the future, computers are going to be able to recognize your face. And they're going to be able to tell someone exactly where you were and what time you were at a certain time. And they could combine that with your credit card records, and natural language processing definitely makes that possible. So there is governance with that, citizens in that place.
Thanks. Next, we have a few questions about social media, I guess, and connecting people.
Yes.
Can you talk about the role of social media in the Occupy movement?
In the Occupy movement? Well, I don't know too much about the Occupy movement per se, but I know that people share pictures. They share pictures of their friends going on there, and that might inspire them themselves to go and do that. And so I know that motivated some people, like my brother-in-law. He's kind of a photographer, and also I think my sister. I talked to my sister maybe a few times a month, and she said that, gosh, I want to go out there. It's like I want to participate in that Occupy movement. So maybe she's a little bit disaffected with how things are going.
Yeah. This person saw a connection between, this actually saw a disconnect. The Tea Party is older and less technologically savvy generally, but they had a bigger effect, whereas the Occupy movement was more technologically savvy and had less of an effect. Do you have any thoughts on that, or just?
I don't know if that's necessarily true. So the question is about Tea Party and then Occupy, right? They're kind of on the opposite ends. And I don't know if either one of these groups use technology more, but both these groups, I know that they relied on charismatic speakers to sort of make civic associations and so forth.
All right, thanks. Next one, you mentioned you'd like to help government agencies communicate better.
Sure, yeah.
Which agency of the government is the most taciturn? Which one doesn't speak, or which one doesn't communicate the best? Which one would you like to help the most?
All of them.
All of them. Okay.
Yeah, all of them are actually kind of taciturn. They're actually kind of, what do you call it? They're a little bit, yeah, they're kind of stingy with their data. So actually, Tim Berners-Lee, so there's a good quote of him saying that the government should just give all the data that they have out on, and just put it out on the internet. Just do it. And his theory was very generous. His theory was that government didn't do this because they wanted pretty looking websites. And so that's the reason why they haven't unloaded all this data. But this data, think about all the areas that government touches you, in the areas of health, in the areas of commerce and transportation, in terms of civil infrastructure. And so government has a lot of data that affects you and I on a daily level. And if they put that on the internet, then people can kind of write apps and develop and make sense of that information.
Okay. And this will be our last question. How would you relate Berkeley to Gwangju?
How would I relate Berkeley to Gwangju?
Yeah.
I had to go back to stereotypes, right? And so I have stereotypes. Well, I guess a stereotype that people have of Berkeley is that we're kind of about activism, right? And I think maybe in my case today that's definitely true, right? So there's definitely that activism strain. I think that we have people like Mario Savi, and we have student protests, at UC Berkeley. And here in Gwangju, you guys had the 518 protest, which was, in my opinion, it was inspiring that people would give up their lives to do that, to demonstrate against the government of Park Chung-hee. And so I think Gwangju and Berkeley definitely share that activism, and I think you guys have kind of the laid-backness that I really appreciate here.
Okay, that's the end of the Q&A. If you had a question and I didn't get a chance to ask it, please feel free to come up to the speaker after the talk and ask him directly. So let's give him a round of applause.